Hello, this is a contribution from Kuzu Console to the Algorand ecosystem by Stephen Sunday and Seth Michael. In this presentation, we will learn how to develop a decentralized application in the form of a mobile app using the Xamarin Framework to build an asset on the Algorand Network. So right here, I have my Visual Studio 2019 open. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. So we'll be taken to this window where we can select the type of template or application we want to develop. In this case, we want to use Xamarin Framework or Xamarin Forms, rather, with the Xamarin Framework to create our mobile application. So go ahead and use the search bar right here and search for Xamarin, and then scroll down a little and then click on Mobile App with Xamarin Forms. So this particular template is what we're going to use. Click on it and then click on Next. So we'll then be taken to this window where we can configure our mobile application. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this to building assets on Algorand. Building assets Algorand rather. Right, so go ahead and name the project or rename it and then click on create. So we'll also be taken to this window after doing that to select the template we want to use, be it a flyout or a tab. I'm going to go ahead and leave it as a flyout. We can see our target items here, Android and iOS. So go ahead and click on it. If it's not checked, check them up, and then also make sure you use the flyout, or you can use any other one you wish to use, and then click on create. So right here we can see that our project has created successfully. We can see the getting started text file with the welcome message. That means our project has successfully created. So let's head over to Solution Explorer. We can see the files or class libraries and the targeted versions that we have. These are class library where we're going to write our code, and then this is the building asset for the Android version, and then this is for the iOS version. So with Xamarin we can write cross-platform applications that can work on many different targeted versions, be it an Android and iOS or a Windows application. So the first thing we're going to want to do here is we're going to install the Algorand package into our application. So to do that, head over to Solution, right click on it, and then click on Manage NuGet Packages for Solution. Click on it also. So head over to Browse, the Browse option, and search for Algorand. Like I've done over here, and then we can see the package right here. So click on the package and then click on this checkbox for the whole project so we can install it on all of them. So do that and then click on install. So go ahead and click on OK and then click on accept. So this will install the package, or the package is already being installed. You can check that. Alright, so our package has successfully installed into our application. So we can do that by checking or going over to the install tab here, and then still on the Algorand, so we can see it right here. It has been installed successfully. We can also see it right here that we have it installed. We can also uninstall it if you want to. So the next thing we're going to do, we're going to create the view page of our building asset, of where and how we can build an asset. So we're going to build or create the view page and also write the code functionalities behind. So head over to Solution Explorer. Inside of the building assets class library, right click on views, click on add, and then click a new item. So we're going to add a view page, which is a content page, right? So content page, I'm going to go ahead and rename this to build assets. Alright, so our page has created successfully. We can also cross check or double check that, so we can see it right here. Our build assets, we can see this is where we're going to write the code behind functionalities for it, and then this is the UI where we can design our form and everything. So inside the build asset.xaml page, I just added some code snippets here. where our input fields will be our entry fields for the necessary fields that need to be inputted for us to create or build an asset on the Algorand network. So I'm going to go ahead and maximize it. It's a grid as I added. We have a grid arrow definition. Here it's set to automatic. And then we have a scroll view here. This is where our entry fields are containing the stack layout. We have the settings or customizations of our stack layout, and then we have a label which signifies building an asset, and then another label with a text saying learn how to build an asset on the Algorand network with its own configurations with font sizes and settings. So here we have an entry field for our creator mnemonic key, because our asset is going to have a creator, a manager, and some other details about it. So we have the creator mnemonic key, we have the manager mnemonic key, we have the asset name, that's the asset name of the asset we're trying to create, we have the unit name, we have the URL. Okay, so we have all these parameters in place, and then a button which says create asset. So upon clicking this button, the whole process of creating the asset will then will come into place inside of the create asset functionality. It is located in the code behind where the functionality is. And then we have another entry for asset ID. So after we create an asset following the following fields here, or after filling in the following entry fields here, the creator mnemonic key, the manager mnemonic key, the asset name, the unit name, and the URL, we then click on the button. This will create the asset for us and then return an asset ID back into this entry field. By default, the field is not enabled, is false. When it's that means it is not enabled. So after we create the asset, the entry field will then become enabled, which is going to be true. So we can copy our asset ID, and then we can look up our asset by its ID on the Algorand portal or network. So right here, where our code behind is for our build asset.xaml.cs. This is where the functionality or code will be written and then connected together with our UI when certain things are handled. Okay, so we can see a method here called create async. Is a private asynchronous method which is void. Now, what this method handles is the process of creating an asset on the Algorand network. And then if you look back inside of the UI, the build asset.xaml, where our button is, the unclicked event for this button is the create asset, which is this method that we have here. So anytime that button is being clicked, we're trying to call this method, or telling this method here that, okay, we're clicking you, handle what you're supposed to handle, or do what you're supposed to do. In this case, we're trying to build or create an asset on the Algorand network. Alright, so it is also called an event handler, but buttons are called event handlers. What happens, what event should happen when certain things are clicked on, or when something happens. So back here, we have our parameters here. We have our Algorand API address, we have our Algorand API token. Our Algorand API address is running on the testnet on the PureStack version 2, which is what we have here, PS2, PureStack on version 2, and then we have our Algorand API token here. Okay, so right here we have an instance of our Algorand API called Algorand API instance, passing in our parameters for Algorand API address and Algorand API token. Okay, so here we have account addresses, account address 1 and account address 2. Okay, so this is where we're going to pass in the mnemonic key of our account address 1 and account address 2. And then mind you, we have parameters over here for our account mnemonic keys or passphrases. So for account 1, which is the creator mnemonic key, that is the creator of the asset, or the person, the mnemonic key of that person trying to create the asset. And then for account 2, we have manager mnemonic key, and this is the manager or the person who whose address is going to be used to make some certain adjustments or functionalities to the asset if the person wants to freeze the asset or do some additional things with the asset. Okay, so right here we have also instances of accounts for account 1 and 2, passing in account 1 mnemonic key, which is what we have here, and then account 2 for account 2 mnemonic key, which is what we have here. And then we have our Algorand API instance creating a variable called transparams, in short for transaction parameters. All right, making use of the transaction parameters built-in method that we have. So in the next step here, this is where we're going to declare what the details of our assets will be. So here we have creating an asset variable of creating a new object of our asset parameter. So if you hover over our asset, we can see a list of optional parameters that we have that we need to pass in. We have a string of clawback, creator, decimals, frozen, manager, all the additional functions that it's needed to be filled in to create an asset. So we don't need all of them. We don't need to use all of them. This is what we need to create an asset, or these are the parameters that we need to create an asset on the Algorand network. So we have our creator, which is obviously our account 1, and then the name of the asset, which is the asset name that will be gotten from our UI over here. That is the creator mnemonic key, manager mnemonic key, the asset name, the unit name, the URL. So all these things are going to be passed in here. So we have our creator account 1.address gotten from the mnemonic key, and then the asset name, we're passing it directly to this place here where the name would be after we fill it in from our user interface, and then our unit name also will be gotten from there. And then we have a total here. It's by default it's about 1,000 or 10,000 rather of the asset. So we have decimals configured to be 0, our URL, which will be gotten from the UI when the user is trying to create the asset, and then we have a metadata hash, which is a byte array, an AXI encoding.AXI containing a byte array of list of bytes, an array of bytes rather. And then we have a manager. Now this manager obviously is going to be gotten from our account 2, because the second account mnemonic key is for the manager, which you can see over here at the top. So that is what we're passing in here. All right, then down below we have our transaction parameters. So right here we have a variable called tx for transaction, in short, making use of the utils.getCreateAssetTransaction. All right, so in this built-in method, we're going to pass in our AP, which we have here for our asset parameters, and then we have our transaction parameters also, and then a message which is asset transaction message. So if you hover over it, you can see the details, asset parameters, and then a transaction parameter response for our transparams, and then a string of message. All right, so this is these are the details that we have so far, and then we're making use of it when we're trying to create an asset transaction. So we have the AP for asset parameters, we have our transaction parameters, and then a message. Then right here we have a signed transaction by the sender, making use of our account 1, containing the signed transaction of our transaction, which we have above it over here. And then below we have a long, which is nullable by default, containing our asset ID, and the asset ID is set to 0. So we then have a try and catch exception error in case we come across an error. We have a variable containing variable and ID containing our utils, as making use of the utils.submit transaction, passing in the Algorand API instance, and then a signed transaction, which we have over here. So we can then print out or do whatever we want to do with the transaction. We can decide to print out or display the transaction ID, or display the ground. But then in this situation, we just want to get the assets ID back, so we do not need to return this on our mobile app. Unless you want to, you can then create an extra entry fields for it to return it back. So we then have a transaction here making use of Algorand API instance, the pending transaction information. So this is going to wait until everything is done and before the next thing will happen. We have our asset ID, passing in our asset ID, which was initially saved to 0 over here. We're then passing in our PTX over here, pending transaction dot asset index. Now this asset index is actually the ID that we're going to make use of for our asset. It means our asset ID. Then we have catch exception. Should in case you come across an error, we can return customized type of message that we want to return. Then down below we have await display alert. We're going to then display the asset ID back into our user, back to our user on the UI, that's the user interface. And then after doing that, we're then going to enable the asset ID entry field, which was disabled right here. We can see it's enabled here, is set to false. But then after doing this, after we get an asset ID, we want to then enable it and then return our asset ID back into the asset ID text on the entry field that we have in our UI. So having done this and written all these code snippets, if you are following along, we can then decide, or at this point we're basically done with the process of creating an asset. We can then head over here, and then if you have an emulator, built-in emulator that you have, you can decide to launch your application using the emulator of your choice. Or if you have an Android application or iOS, you can always head over here. If you're using an Android, set the Android as a startup project like this, and then connect your device via USB cable and then launch it on your device. If you're using an iOS, you can always set the iOS version as the startup project and also connect your device to it and then launch. So having created the assets through our mobile application, we can head over to the testnet.algoexplorer.io. We're running it on the testnet because our application was done or built on the testnet itself. So head over to the this link, testnet.algoexplorer.io, then head over to assets. So this is where we're going to search or look up for our asset and the details of our asset which was created. So go ahead and put in the assets, or based on this search bar here, we can search by an address, we can search by a transaction ID, a group transaction ID, asset name, block, or the asset ID. So we have our asset name and we have our asset ID, so we can set to use any of them. Let me start by using the asset ID first. So I'm going to go ahead and put in the asset ID here. Okay, so we can see it right here, Kuzu Consult asset, which was the asset we created. Go ahead and click on it. Okay, so we can see our asset, Kuzu Consult asset, and then run the URL, which is kuzukonsult.com. We have the unit name, which was KCA, as we inputted. We have the ID, we have the reserve address, we have the creator address. Reserve address is the manager address. That's the second mnemonic key that we put in, and then default frozen set to false, and then number of transfers 1. So we can see when it was done about 15 minutes ago. So this are the information, or this is the information we can see as we have successfully created the assets on the Algorand network. So if we head over to the technical information, we can see the manager address, which is the same thing as the reserved address, but then we called it manager address when we were creating. We have the freeze address, which is set to the manager address, and additional fields about it. So we can see our clawback decimals, which was set to 0 from the code behind, and other details about it. So we have successfully created an asset on the Algorand network. At this stage, we have come to the end of this tutorial and demo. We have successfully created a mobile application using the Xamarin Framework We have connected our application to the Algorand network by installing the SDK, and then we have learned how to build an asset, which was the main goal or purpose of this tutorial. Once again, this is a contribution from Kuzu Console to the Algorand ecosystem by Steven Sunday and Seth Michael.